Something incredible happened on a quiet, unsuspecting night. An event so wild, so earth-shattering, it would leave jaws dropping and hearts pounding across an entire city. Picture this. A woman, exhausted from saving lives, driving home under a sky painted in deep, brooding blues, the faint glow of streetlights her only companions. This wasn't just any woman. This was Emily Carter, a 32-year-old black nurse who'd spent her day battling chaos in the Central Hospital. Her hands, still trembling from the weight of her shift, gripped the steering wheel of her old sedan as she longed for the simple solace of her apartment. A soft couch, a warm meal, a moment to breathe. The radio hummed softly, a feeble attempt to drown out the echoes of beeping monitors and desperate voices that lingered in her mind. But then, out of nowhere, the night exploded into chaos. Blinding red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the stillness like a knife. The wail of sirens tore apart the calm, a sound so jarring it made her stomach twist into knots. Emily's heart sank, no, it plummeted as she glanced back, her pulse racing faster with every second. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a red light. She'd broken no laws. So why? Why was this happening? Her mind scrambled for answers as she signaled, pulling over to the curb with a slow, deliberate precision, her hands shaking as she shut off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the sirens had been, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She rolled down her window, letting the cold night air rush in, a shiver crawling up her spine as it brushed against her skin. In the mirror, she saw him, a tall, imposing figure stepping out of the police cruiser, his uniform crisp, his black boots clicking against the pavement with every deliberate step. The flashing lights illuminated his face as he approached, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A smug, self-assured smirk that screamed trouble. His badge read Mark Thompson, and when he spoke, his voice was ice, sharp, distant, devoid of even a shred of kindness. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, but there was nothing good about it. His hand rested on his belt, hovering near his gun, a silent threat that made her breath catch in her throat. Emily forced herself to stay calm, drawing a deep breath as she met his gaze. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a tension she couldn't hide. Mark tilted his head, that mocking smirk widening as he leaned in closer. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. She frowned, searching her memory. No traffic violations, no mistakes, nothing. "No, officer," she replied firmly. "I don't believe I've broken any laws." His response was a short, sharp laugh, a sound so cold it sent a chill racing through her veins. He looked her over, his eyes lingering on her nurse's scrubs, stained with the day's exhaustion, and then he said it. "A woman like you, driving alone through this neighborhood at this hour, seems a bit out of place, don't you think?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "A woman like you." She knew exactly what he meant, knew it from the way his gaze hardened, from the venom in his tone. This wasn't about traffic. This was about her skin, about the assumptions he'd already made before she'd even opened her mouth. Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior, but she fought to keep it in check. "I live in this area," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "I just finished my shift at the hospital and I'm heading home." Mark's smirk didn't falter. "Interesting," he drawled, his sarcasm cutting deeper with every syllable. "But are you sure you're not hiding something, Miss Carter?" Her heart clenched. Hiding something. The accusation was baseless, absurd, yet it hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice growing steadier, firmer as she clung to the truth. "If there's an issue, I'm happy to cooperate, but I don't believe I deserve this treatment." Mark didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes raking over her car with an invasive scrutiny that made her skin crawl. The cold night air was nothing compared to the chill of his gaze, a piercing stare that seemed to search for guilt where there was none. He stood there in silence, the hum of his cruiser's engine and the rustle of leaves the only sounds breaking the tension. And then he spoke again, his lips curling into a sneer. "You say you live here?" he asked, each word dripping with disbelief. "You don't exactly look like someone who belongs in this neighborhood. It's strange to see someone like you driving around here at this hour. Are you sure you have nothing to hide? The blatant prejudice in his words was a slap to the face, a wound that reopened every time she'd faced it before, and she had faced it before, more times than she could count. But this time, it was different. This time, it was a man with a badge, a gun, and the power to turn her life upside down. Emily swallowed hard, her anger bubbling hotter, but she knew losing control wasn't an option. Not here, not now. If you'd like, I can provide documents to prove it, she said, her voice measured but strained, every word a battle to keep her composure. Mark shook his head, that smirk widening into something uglier. You think saying that is enough? He shot back. I think I'll need to take a closer look. Who knows what you might be hiding? Maybe something illegal. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles whitening as she fought to stay calm. Officer, I'm not carrying anything illegal, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I don't see any valid reason for you to search my car. Mark crossed his arms, his gaze now blazing with defiance. Are you implying I don't know how to do my job? He snapped. People like you, they always act innocent, but when we dig deeper, things often turn out very differently. There it was again, people like you. The phrase was a dagger, deliberate and loaded, slicing through any pretense of fairness. Emily froze, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was a power play, a humiliation, a blatant abuse of authority, and she was trapped in the middle of it, her heart pounding as the night grew darker around her. The air around Emily Carter's car grew thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her as Officer Mark Thompson stood there, his smug face illuminated by the relentless flashing of his cruiser's lights. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from guilt, but from the raw, gnawing unease of being targeted for no reason other than who she was. She told him the truth. She lived here, she worked at the hospital, she'd done nothing wrong. But the truth didn't matter to him. To Mark, she was a suspect before she'd even rolled down her window, her black skin enough to ignite his suspicion, his prejudice, his need to dominate. You think you can tell me how to do my job? He barked, his voice sharp and hostile as he leaned closer, his breath fogging in the cold night air. I'm here to protect this neighborhood from people who don't belong. The words landed like a bombshell, exploding in Emily's mind with a force that left her reeling. Don't belong. Her mouth fell open, shock mingling with a rising tide of indignation. Are you seriously saying I have no right to be here based solely on how I look? She demanded, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a fury she could barely contain. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any response, a confirmation of the ugliness she'd already seen in his eyes. Instead, he reached for the radio on his shoulder, pressing the button with a deliberate slowness that sent a shiver down her spine. Thompson here, he said into the crackling device, his voice steady but laced with menace. Requesting additional support at my location. I've got a situation that needs further investigation. Emily's heart sank deeper, her knuckles whitening as her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Backup? For what? A routine stop that wasn't even routine, just a baseless, prejudiced hunch. What are you doing? She asked, her voice betraying the frustration clawing at her insides. I haven't violated any traffic laws. This is just a baseless stop. Mark turned back to her, his eyes hardening into something cold and unyielding. You think you can question me? He shot back. I decide what's suspicious here, not you. Before she could respond, the distant wail of another siren pierced the night, and soon a second police car rolled up, its lights adding to the oppressive glow that bathed the scene. A younger officer stepped out, his uniform pristine, his expression serious but uncertain as he approached. What's going on, Thompson? He asked, glancing between Mark and Emily's car. This situation seems suspicious, Mark replied, his voice loud enough for Emily to hear every word. She's uncooperative and acting suspicious. I think we need to conduct a more thorough check. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. Uncooperative, she exclaimed, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. I've explained myself and even offered to show my documentation, but he hasn't listened. Mark glared at her, his eyes narrowing into a silent warning. You'd better watch your tone, Carter, he said, his voice low and threatening. You don't want to make this worse. Worse? How could it get worse? She was already sitting here, humiliated, accused of crimes she hadn't committed, her every word twisted against her. Emily felt her body stiffen, a storm of emotions swirling inside her, anger, helplessness, fear. She knew the stakes. She knew that in moments like this, any reaction could be spun into resistance. Any protest could be used to justify whatever came next. But the injustice was suffocating, a weight she couldn't bear in silence. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "I've made it clear I haven't done anything wrong. If you want to search my car, I demand a proper warrant." Mark let out a derisive laugh, a sound so cruel it made her skin crawl. "A warrant?" he mocked, signaling to his colleague with a flick of his hand. "Check the exterior. Let's see what she's hiding." The younger officer hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty, but he complied, stepping toward the car as Mark watched with that same smug satisfaction. Emily sat frozen in her seat, her breath short and shallow as she watched them circle her vehicle, their flashlights probing every inch like vultures searching for prey. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, a suffocating tide that threatened to drown her. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. It was a public shamming, a deliberate attempt to break her down. Her hands stayed clenched on the wheel, her mind racing as she fought to hold onto her composure. And then, a sharp vibration jolted her from her thoughts. Her phone, resting on the seat beside her, buzzed with a new message. She glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the sender, an unknown number. With a trembling hand, she opened it, and the words on the screen sent a chill racing through her. "Be careful, they're watching you." Her breath caught in her throat. Who was this? How did they know she was here, trapped in this nightmare? She scanned the street through her window, her eyes darting past Mark and his colleague, searching for some unseen observer. Had someone been following her? She'd noticed a strange car near her apartment a few times recently, always gone before she could get a good look, but she'd brushed it off as paranoia. Now it didn't feel like a coincidence. "What are you doing?" Mark's voice snapped her back to reality, his eyes narrowing as he caught her reaching for the phone. "I'm not doing anything," she said quickly, placing the phone back on the seat, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. "I was just checking the time." Mark stared at her, his suspicion palpable, before turning to his colleague with a curt nod. "We need to check the trunk," he said. "I've got a feeling something's off here." Emily's anger surged, breaking through her restraint. "You can't do that without a proper warrant," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "You're abusing your authority, and I won't let this go unchallenged." Mark paused, his face hardening into a mask of fury. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" he snarled. "You seem pretty confident, Carter, but I'd suggest you cooperate before things get worse." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Anything she said could be twisted, turned into ammunition against her. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her gaze steady and unflinching, a silent defiance that spoke louder than words. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Mark noticed. "Your phone buzzing again," he said, his tone dripping with accusation. "Are you talking to someone, hiding something?" "I'm not talking to anyone," she replied evenly. "You're welcome to check, but I won't let you touch my belongings without a legitimate cause." Mark grunted, stepping back but keeping his piercing gaze fixed on her. Another message flashed on her screen. "Don't react too strongly. They're trying to take you down." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't random. Someone was watching, someone who knew exactly what was happening. But who and why? The questions swirled in her mind as Mark moved to the back of her car, muttering something to his colleague she couldn't hear. The night was spiraling into something bigger, something darker, and Emily felt it in her bones. This wasn't just about Mark's prejudice anymore. There was a shadow lurking behind this encounter, a thread she couldn't yet grasp. The flashing lights reflected off her window, a relentless reminder of the danger she was in, and deep inside, a spark of realization ignited. This was only the beginning of a fight she hadn't signed up for, but one she wouldn't back down from. Emily Carter sat in her car, the weight of the night pressing down on her like a storm cloud ready to burst. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the street in eerie reds and blues, a constant, pulsing reminder of the trap she'd been ensnared in. Officer Mark Thompson and his younger colleague circled her vehicle, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, their flashlights probing every corner as if they could will evidence into existence. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from fear now, but from a simmering rage she could no longer suppress. This wasn't justice. This was a vendetta, a power trip fueled by prejudice, and she was the target. Her phone lay silent on the seat beside her, the cryptic messages, "Be careful. They're watching you and don't react too strongly. They're trying to take you down," burning in her mind like a warning flare. Who was behind them? Were they a friend, a witness, or something more sinister? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she forced herself to focus, to breathe, to stay sharp. Mark's voice cut through her thoughts as he barked something to his colleague, too low for her to catch. The younger officer nodded, his hesitation fading under Mark's commanding glare, and they moved toward the trunk again, their intent clear. "You can't do this," Emily called out, her voice steady but edged with defiance. "I know my rights. You need a warrant." Mark spun around, his smirk replaced by a scowl that twisted his face into something uglier. "Keep talking, Carter," he snapped. "You're only making this harder for yourself." Harder. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Harder than being stopped for no reason, accused without evidence, humiliated on a quiet street she called home. But before she could respond, a new sound broke through the tension, a low rumble growing louder, closer. Headlights sliced through the darkness, and Emily squinted into her rearview mirror, her breath catching as she recognized the vehicle pulling up behind Mark's cruiser. It wasn't just any car. It bore the unmistakable insignia of the city's police commissioner. Relief flooded through her, sharp and sudden, but it was tempered by a flicker of apprehension. The door swung open, and out stepped a tall, imposing man in a sharp suit, his presence radiating authority that seemed to shift the very air around them. John Carter, her father, strode forward, his commanding steps cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. Mark stiffened, his smugness faltering as he caught sight of John. His face paled, a flash of panic darting across his features before he masked it with a shaky composure. The younger officer straightened instinctively, his uncertainty deepening as he realized something big was unfolding. "What's going on here, Officer Thompson?" John's voice was low, steady, and laced with an authority that demanded answers. His eyes swept the scene, Emily's car, the circling officers, the flashing lights, taking it all in with a sharpness that missed nothing. Mark stammered, his confidence crumbling under John's gaze. "Commissioner, sir," he began, his voice unsteady, "I was conducting a traffic stop. This woman seemed suspicious and I felt a check was necessary." John's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening into something icy. "Suspicious in what way?" he pressed. "What traffic violation did she commit?" Mark faltered, his words tripping over themselves. I thought she might not belong in this neighborhood. She could be carrying something illegal." John's gaze turned razor-sharp, cutting through Mark's flimsy excuse like paper. "So, no specific reason for the stop, just your baseless suspicions." His tone grew more assertive, each word a hammer blow. "Do you even realize who she is?" Mark hesitated, glancing nervously at Emily, his bravado evaporating. I don't, sir," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. John stepped closer, his presence towering over the rattled officer. "She's my daughter," he said, each syllable landing with the weight of a thunderclap. "She just finished a long shift at the hospital, and instead of getting the rest she deserves, she's being subjected to your abusive power." The revelation hit like a shockwave. Mark's jaw tightened, his discomfort palpable as he struggled to hold his ground. The younger officer shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between his partner and the commissioner, clearly aware they'd crossed a line. Emily, still in her car, felt the dynamic shift, a surge of strength replacing the helplessness that had gripped her moments before. Her father's arrival wasn't just a rescue. It was a turning point, a crack in the wall of injustice she'd been slamming against all night. John turned to her, his stern expression softening as he met her eyes. "Are you okay, Emily?" he asked, his voice warm with concern. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm fine," she said, her tone steady but resolute, "but this isn't right. I've done nothing wrong, yet they've chosen to harass me." John's face darkened as he turned back to Mark. "You heard her, Officer Thompson," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Step away from my daughter's car immediately and explain your actions. I won't let this slide." Mark clenched his jaw, grappling with the gravity of his situation. "Sir, I had no ill intent," he muttered, his voice weak. "I was just following protocol." John cut him off, his tone sharp as steel. "Don't make excuses. Protocol doesn't permit you to target someone based on personal bias. I'll ensure this incident is thoroughly investigated, and if you've abused your authority, there will be consequences." The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of John's words. Mark lowered his head, his hands clenching at his sides, while his colleague remained silent, shame and fear flickering across his face. John tapped lightly on Emily's window, his demeanor shifting to one of quiet strength. "Step out, Emily," he said. "Let's sort this out." She opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, her legs steady now, her confidence surging as she stood beside her father. Mark retreated slightly, his unease growing as he watched them, the power he'd wielded slipping through his fingers like sand. "This isn't over," John said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'll personally oversee the investigation into your actions. And let me remind you, no one is above the law, not even those in uniform." Neither Mark nor his colleague dared respond, their silence a stark admission of defeat. Emily glanced at her father, her heart swelling with gratitude but also with a burning determination. This wasn't just about her anymore, she could feel it. Something deeper was at play, a thread of corruption or malice she couldn't yet see. The night had started as a personal nightmare, but it was unraveling into something bigger, something that could shake the foundations of the system Mark represented. As John confronted Mark with a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, Emily stood taller, the fear that had gripped her melting away. "Do you realize what you've done?" John said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "This isn't just personal misconduct, it's a disgrace to this entire department. Do you think abusing power and practicing discrimination is justifiable?" Mark fidgeted, his eyes darting away from John's piercing stare. "Sir, I had no intention of discriminating," he stammered. "I was simply trying to do my job." "Doing your job," John snapped, stepping closer. "Your job doesn't include making baseless stops, issuing snide remarks, and intimidating an innocent citizen, especially because of the color of their skin. This is racial profiling, and I won't tolerate it." Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. "Mark," she said, her voice steady and piercing, "you stopped me without any valid reason. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here simply because I'm a black woman. This isn't the first time I've faced behavior like yours, but this time, I won't let it slide." Her words struck Mark like a blow, his fists clenching as he fumbled for a response. I just thought you might be hiding something illegal," he muttered. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." John's brows furrowed, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You had no evidence, no justifiable reason," he said. "Yet you harassed a woman who just finished saving lives. Do you think that's lawful conduct? Do you believe a badge gives you the right to do whatever you please?" Mark bowed his head, speechless, his earlier smugness stripped away under the weight of John's authority and Emily's resolve. She fixed her gaze on him, her fear replaced by a fire that burned brighter with every passing second. "You didn't just wrong me," she said, her voice unwavering. "You wronged every person you're supposed to protect. You don't represent justice, you represent injustice, and I will ensure your actions are held accountable." Mark took a step back, cornered and exposed as the tide turned against him. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a reckoning, and Emily was ready to see it through. The night air hung heavy as Officer Mark Thompson's cruiser pulled away, its flashing lights fading into the distance like a retreating storm. Emily Carter stood beside her father, John Carter, the police commissioner, her chest still tight with the echoes of anger and humiliation. The confrontation had ended, for now, but the fire it had ignited within her burned hotter than ever. What had started as a personal injustice was morphing into something far greater, a call to action she couldn't ignore. She glanced at John, his stern face softened by pride and concern, and felt a surge of gratitude. But gratitude wasn't enough. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Back in her apartment that night, Emily couldn't sleep. The events replayed in her mind like a relentless film reel. Mark's sneering face, his cutting words, "people like you," the invasive scrutiny of her car, the cryptic messages on her phone. "They're watching you." The words haunted her, a shadowy thread she couldn't unravel. She sat on her couch, the soft cushions offering no comfort, her dinner untouched on the table. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside her window sent her pulse racing. Was someone out there? Was this bigger than just one prejudiced cop? The questions gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. By morning, the exhaustion had given way to resolve. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, and she wouldn't let this night define her as anything less. She picked up her phone and dialed Sarah Collins, a civil rights attorney whose name carried weight in the city. Sarah's voice was warm but firm when she answered. "Emily, I've heard whispers about what happened. Tell me everything." Emily poured out the story. The stop, the harassment, the threats veiled in Mark's words, her father's intervention. Sarah listened in silence, her sharp mind already at work. When Emily finished, Sarah's tone grew serious. "This isn't just about one officer. It's a symptom of a rotting system. We can't let it end with a slap on the wrist. I'm with you, let's make this count." Next, Emily reached out to Michael Reed, a social activist with a track record of shaking up the status quo. They met at a small cafe, the hum of conversation around them a stark contrast to the gravity of their discussion. Michael leaned forward, his eyes alight with conviction. "Your story's already spreading, Emily," he said. "People are angry. We can turn this into a movement, a real push for change. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been silenced by badge-wearing bullies like Thompson." Emily nodded, her determination hardening. "I'm in," she said. "Let's do this." Together, the trio, Emily, Sarah, and Michael, set to work. They contacted local organizations, rallied community leaders, and tapped into online networks buzzing with outrage. Posters sprang up across the city. "Justice for Emily, reform now, end discrimination." A hashtag, #JusticeForEmily, took root on social media, spreading like wildfire. But the real turning point came when a bystander's video surfaced online. Someone had captured the entire encounter. Mark's condescending tone, his baseless accusations, Emily's calm but firm defiance. The footage was raw, unfiltered, and undeniable, and within hours it exploded across platforms, racking up millions of views. The media pounced. CNN ran a segment. "Racial profiling in the spotlight again, Emily Carter's story demands answers." The BBC called it a wake-up call for systemic reform. The New York Times headline blared, "One woman's traffic stop sparks a national reckoning." Public response was swift and fierce. Celebrities tweeted support, artists penned songs, activists flooded the internet with calls for justice. Emily's phone buzzed nonstop with messages of solidarity, but one stood out, a text from that same unknown number. "You're not alone. Keep going." Her heart raced. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, but the words fueled her fire. The first rally came together in a matter of days, set in the city's central square. Thousands poured in, a sea of faces stretching as far as Emily could see, black, white, young, old, all united by a shared outrage. Signs bobbed above the crowd. "We stand with Emily, no more injustice, justice for all." The air crackled with energy, a palpable hunger for change. Emily stepped onto the makeshift stage, her knees trembling but her voice steady as she gripped the microphone. "Today, I stand here not just for myself," she began, her words cutting through the noise, "but for everyone who's ever been treated unjustly, for those who couldn't speak out, for those crushed by abuse of power and discrimination. We can't stay silent anymore. Now is the time for change." The crowd erupted, a roar of applause and chants, "Justice now," shaking the square. Sarah and Michael stood beside her, their presence a quiet anchor as she spoke. "I was stopped because of the color of my skin," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "But this isn't new, it's not rare. It's a scar on the system that's bled for too long. We have the right to demand better, a system where no one, judged by how they look, where power protects, not punishes. And I promise you, we won't stop until we get it." The cheers grew deafening, a tidal wave of support that lifted her higher than she'd ever felt. As the rally wound down, Emily stepped off the stage, her heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Michael clapped her on the shoulder. "You did it, Emily. This is the spark, but it's only the beginning." Sarah nodded, her eyes sharp with purpose. "We've got their attention. Now we push for real reform. This can't just be noise, it has to be action." Emily agreed, but a quiet resolve settled in her chest. She thought of the threats, the video, the movement swelling around her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs, all of theirs, and she'd carry it as far as it needed to go. Back home that night, she stared out her window at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the dark. The rally had been a victory, a thunderous declaration that they wouldn't back down, but she knew the road ahead was treacherous. Mark Thompson was just one face of a deeper rot, and uprooting it would mean facing resistance, maybe even danger. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the unknown sender. "They're scared, stay strong." She set it down, her jaw tightening. Scared, good, they should be. Because Emily Carter wasn't just a nurse or a daughter anymore. She was a force, and she was coming for justice, no matter the cost. The movement Emily Carter had sparked was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, echoing through the city and beyond. The rally in Central Square had lit a fuse, and now the flames were spreading. Media outlets couldn't get enough. Every channel, every headline screamed her name, her story, her fight. Social media was a battlefield of hashtags. #Justice for Emily, systemic change now, trending nationwide as voices joined the chorus, demanding reform. Emily wasn't just a woman who'd been wronged. She'd become a symbol, a beacon for those who'd suffered in silence, a lightning rod for a nation ready to confront its flaws. But with every step forward came a shadow creeping closer. The morning after the rally, Emily woke to a phone buzzing with menace. A string of anonymous messages glared up at her from the screen. "You think you're safe? Watch your back. You don't know who you're messing with. Stop now before it's too late." Her stomach churned, the words sinking in like ice water. She'd expected pushback, anger, criticism, even mockery. But this was a threat, raw and real, a warning that her fight had rattled someone powerful. She set the phone down, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the air heavier. She called Sarah Collins immediately, her voice low but steady as she read the messages aloud. Sarah's response was calm, measured, but firm. "Emily, this isn't new in cases like this. They're trying to scare you, to break your momentum. Don't let them. We'll report this to the police. Your father will know what to do." Emily agreed, but the unease lingered like a fog she couldn't shake. Later, she showed the text to John Carter, her father's face darkening as he scrolled through them. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice rough with protective fury. "I'll get trusted officers on it, find out who's behind this. But you need to stay vigilant. They're desperate, and desperate people do stupid things." The threats didn't stop. Over the next few days, they multiplied, short, sharp jabs like "stop now or you'll regret it," and longer, venomous rants that made her skin crawl. One morning, an unmarked envelope slipped under her apartment door, a single sheet of paper inside with scrawled handwriting. "We're watching you." Emily's heart pounded as she stared at it, her mind racing. She checked her locks, peered out her window at the empty street below, but saw nothing, just the quiet hum of a city that now felt like a battlefield. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise a potential threat. Sleep became a stranger. One night she froze in her living room, her breath shallow as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. She stood motionless, waiting, her pulse thundering in her ears, until she heard a neighbor's door creak open and shut. Just a neighbor. Just a coincidence. But the fear clung to her, a parasite she couldn't shake. She thought of giving up, of letting the movement carry on without her, of retreating to the safety of anonymity. But then she remembered the rally, the faces in the crowd, the stories of pain and resilience, the chance of justice now. She couldn't quit, not for herself, not for them. Sarah and Michael noticed the strain during a meeting at Michael's cluttered office. "You're carrying too much," Sarah said, her voice gentle but insistent. "This is a psychological war now, not just a public one. They want you rattled, don't give them that win." Michael nodded, leaning forward. "You've got a whole community behind you, Emily. If you need us, any of us, just say it. We're in this together." She looked at them, their support a lifeline pulling her back from the edge. "I won't stop," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. "But I won't ignore these threats either. We need to expose whoever's behind them. It's tied to the system we're fighting." John took action fast, mobilizing a small, trusted team within the police department to trace the messages and the envelope. "Whoever's doing this," he told her, "they're not just random cowards. This feels coordinated, someone with a stake in keeping things as they are." Emily nodded, the pieces clicking into place. Mark Thompson wasn't the end. He was a symptom, a cog in a machine that thrived on silence and fear. The threats were proof she'd struck a nerve, that her movement was a threat to something bigger, something uglier. She threw herself back into the fight, refusing to let fear dictate her steps. She attended community meetings, her voice steady as she shared her story and listened to others. Mothers who'd lost sons, workers harassed on their commutes, kids afraid to walk home. Their pain mirrored hers, fueling her resolve. She gave interviews to national outlets, her words sharp and unflinching. This isn't just about one cop or one stop. It's about a system that protects the wrong people and punishes the innocent. We're not stopping until it changes. The public ate it up, her courage amplifying their own. The next protest loomed, a massive gathering planned for Central Square, drawing thousands from across the country. Emily arrived with Sarah and Michael, the sight overwhelming, a sea of signs, a chorus of voices, a united front against injustice. She stepped onto the stage, the crowd's energy washing over her like a wave. "We're here because we're tired," she declared, her voice ringing out. "Tired of being targeted, tired of being silenced, tired of a system that fails us. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. And we will win." The cheers shook the ground, a testament to the power she'd unleashed. As the sun set, stories poured from the crowd. An elderly woman mourning her detained son, a young man recounting a humiliating search. Each one was a brick in the wall of their movement, a reason to keep going. Emily stepped down, exhausted but alive with purpose. Michael grinned. "This is bigger than we dreamed." Sarah added, "Now we make it last." Emily nodded, but her mind drifted to the threats, the unseen enemy lurking in the shadows. They were scared, she could feel it, and that fear only made her stronger. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting, and she'd fight until the end. Emily Carter stood at the edge of a revolution, not just hers, but a nation's. The movement she'd sparked had grown into a wildfire, consuming apathy and igniting hope in its wake. The second protest at Central Square had been a triumph, a thunderous declaration that the people wouldn't back down. Thousands had gathered, activists, families, students, even politicians, waving signs that screamed justice now, end discrimination, systemic reform. The air had buzzed with a raw, electric energy, a collective heartbeat pulsing through the crowd. Emily's words had lit the fuse, but the stories that followed, shared by trembling voices on that stage, had turned it into an explosion. Back home that night, the high of the day crashed against the weight of the threats still haunting her. The anonymous messages hadn't stopped, each one a jagged shard of malice. "You're playing with fire. We'll bury you. This ends soon." The unmarked envelope with its scrawled, "We're watching you," sat on her kitchen counter, a silent taunt she couldn't ignore. She paced her apartment, the walls closing in as fear and defiance warred within her. She built something unstoppable, but at what cost? Was this the price of standing up? A target painted on her back, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her father, John Carter, refused to let her face it alone. The investigation into Mark Thompson's conduct had blown open a Pandora's box of corruption. Years of misconduct swept under complaints, a system that shielded its own. John stood at a press conference days later, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. "Mark Thompson didn't just betray his duty, he betrayed this city," he declared, cameras flashing around him. "We've uncovered a pattern of abuse, unwarranted stops, excessive force, discrimination, all ignored by those who should have acted. This ends now." He announced reforms, an independent oversight board, mandatory anti-racism training, body cameras for every officer. The crowd cheered, but Emily knew it was just the start. Mark was suspended, charged with abuse of power and discrimination, his career in ruins. The media feasted on it. Racist cop faces justice. Emily Carter's fight topples. Emily saw the bigger picture. It's not just him, she told Sarah over the phone, her voice steady but urgent. It's the system that let him thrive. We can't stop here. Sarah agreed. This is momentum, Emily. We push harder, make sure these reforms stick. John echoed her, pulling strings within the department to root out the rot, but resistance simmered. Veteran officers bristling at the changes, whispering that their authority was under attack. Emily didn't flinch. In a TV interview, she faced the camera, her gaze unflinching. If some feel threatened by reform, it proves we're right. This isn't about stripping power, it's about using it to protect, not harm. We won't rest until that's reality. The public roared in support, but the threats grew darker. One night, her phone lit up with a new message. You'll pay for this. She reported it, her father's team tracing leads, but the sender stayed a ghost. Elusive, relentless, a specter of the system she was dismantling. Then came Riverside University. Students, inspired by her story, invited her to speak, their auditorium packed with eager faces. Michael and Sarah flanked her as she stepped onto the stage, the room falling silent. I'm not just here as a victim, she began, her voice warm but fierce. I'm here as someone fighting for all of us. We can't live where power oppresses instead of protects. You, the next generation, you can break this cycle. Use your voices. The applause was thunderous, but a student named Amanda stole the show, announcing an on-campus protest to echo Emily's call. Outside, hundreds chanted "Justice now," as Emily watched, tears stinging her eyes. This was bigger than her. It was theirs. The first reforms hit weeks later, announced at City Hall. John stood tall, detailing the oversight board, the training, the cameras, tangible wins born from their fight. Emily beamed, but her caution held firm. We monitor this, she told Sarah. It's not enough to write laws, we enforce them. She reached out to the ACLU and NAACP, pitching a national campaign. This city's a start, she told their leaders, her passion blazing. But injustice doesn't stop at borders. We scale this up everywhere. They agreed, and the wheels turned. Petitions, rallies, a push for federal reform. Locally, Emily stayed rooted. At a community meeting, an elderly woman gripped her hand, voice trembling. You've given us hope for us, for our kids. Don't stop. The words hit deep, a reminder that this was about people, not just policies. On TV, she reflected, I'm proud, but we're not done. Change isn't one fight, it's all of us together, relentless. That night, she sat with John, a rare, quiet moment. He held up a newspaper, Police Reform. One city smiled. You've changed lives, Emily. She nodded, eyes distant. It's not enough yet. I want justice for everyone who's been silenced. John squeezed her shoulder. You will, it's the community, the unity that makes this real. She felt it then, the strength wasn't just hers, but theirs, thousands standing with her. At another meeting, a young mother spoke. Your story means my kid's future can change. We're not alone. Emily stepped outside, the night sky vast above her, and whispered to herself, we won't stop. This is worth it. Her journey wasn't just a battle, it was a testament, a ripple turning into a wave. The threats lingered, the fight stretched ahead, but she wasn't afraid. With every step, she carried hope, hers, theirs, a future's, and she'd keep going until justice wasn't a dream, but a right for all. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.